Imagine if each morning when you wake up, you're smiling and looking forward to your day, knowing you are happy even while you're dealing with grief and loss. The Grief and Happiness podcasts inspires, comforts, and supports you with each new episode. I'm Emily Thoreau-Threat, welcoming you to explore with me your life of endless possibilities. Aloha. I'm glad you're here today. I have a wonderful guest who's really different from the other guests that I've had so far. And you're going to love her. She's just a beautiful woman and is doing unique work. And I admire that. And she goes by the Grave Woman. So, hello. Can you introduce yourself to our listeners, please?
Hello, Emily, and thank you so much for having me. Hello to your wonderful listeners around the world. My name is Joél Simone Maldonado, and as Emily stated, I go by the moniker The Grave Woman. I am a sacred end-of-life and grief care professional. I am an award-winning educator and founder of the Black Death, Grief, and Cultural Care Academy. I specialize in educating professionals about the importance of cultural competency, inclusion at the end of life, death, and in grief care.
Yeah, I just think that's so important. I see a lot of things that people do about grief or that I hear or read about. They just assume that everybody's the same. And there's so many different cultures and I've been seeing such interesting things around the world that different cultures do that we don't do in the US. And there needs to be a sensitivity for people so that they can have what they're comfortable with and what they want for the dying person and the families and the friends and anybody who surrounds them. So how do you go about doing that?
That's an excellent question. And it's something that I'm kind of working through trial and error doing. For the majority of my career, I've done that in the funeral home setting, working with various funeral homes in Georgia and helping out here in South Carolina. I've recently moved to South Carolina, but in the pandemic, my work shifted from working with families who were grieving and making funeral arrangements and caring for the deceased physically in the funeral home to educating online. And so the way that I do the majority of my work now is through social media, through YouTube, through my podcast, and through my academy.
That's wonderful. Tell us about your academy.
So basically, the Black Death, Grief, and Cultural Care Academy is an online end-of-life and death care academy dedicated to sharing sacred art, wisdom, and knowledge of caring for Black bodies in transition and after death. It was birthed really out of the lack of formal education around caring for Black decedents. When I was in mortuary school, no one in my textbooks looked like me. My professors, outside of maybe one or two, did not look like me. And when we worked on bodies or cadavers, for the most part, the funeral home that I worked with was traditionally and historically white. And so there were no considerations about how to care for Black hair, Black cosmetic care, phenotypical differences, and even how to have conversations with Black families around death and around grief. And I had some pretty horrific experiences that were rooted in racism and ignorance. And in 2020, I'm pretty sure that we can all remember the massacre of George Floyd. Mm-hmm. And my initial response to the way that his body was treated publicly was anger. But I also saw that as an opportunity to educate my coworkers, people that I was training about how to really care for Black people that are dead, that have died in various ways, and how to care for their families and have conversations about what those specific needs were. And so it really started there, talking about hair, again, cosmetic care and phenotypical differences. But then I realized that there was no conversation about cultural intelligence or cultural competency around Blackness. And so I started having those conversations, and it's expanded in the last year or so, from just having conversation with funeral directors to now having conversations with death doulas, end of life workers like healthcare professionals, firefighters, police officers. And so it's expanded in a way that I really didn't expect, but that I'm so grateful for.
Oh, I'm so glad you're doing that work. I really see the need for it. My last husband was Black, and his mother came to live with us. She lived with us for a few years at the end of her life, and she was an elegant lady. She was just beautiful, and she lived in Los Angeles, and she could get all the hair care and cosmetics and anything she needed down there. But where we lived, it was north of Los Angeles on the coast. When she moved in with us, we couldn't find any place to get her hair done. And it was a real challenge. So we ended up, my son was able to drive her to Los Angeles when she needed to get her hair done or buy makeup because it just wasn't available there. And I think people don't think about things like that. And then if it comes to somebody dying and ending up in a funeral home where there aren't any people that know about that kind of hair or makeup that can be very sad for the families and what turns out.
It can. And what's so interesting, and thank you for sharing that story. What's so interesting is that that was acceptable in our industry prior to COVID. And it was acceptable because, especially here in the South, I don't know about in California, but Black people went to Black funeral homes. White people went to historically white funeral homes. Hispanic and Islamic families, they went to either or. But during COVID, people were literally lining up outside of funeral homes asking if we had availability or vacancy at white funeral homes, white people showing up at Black funeral homes. And it eliminated that invisible line of segregation that still existed in 2020. And so it became, in my mind, as it should have been, where professionals were now responsible for caring for people that looked, prayed, worshiped, and grieved differently than maybe your traditional customer.
Yeah, there's just so much to that. I talk to people from different cultures and different places around the world with the podcast. And I think a lot of times people don't consider cultures outside their own. They just don't think of people being any different than they are. And then when they realize they are, it's a problem. Like I lived in California in a small conservative town for not small, it was a big conservative community. And one of the people that worked for me was Jewish, and he was somebody, his family was back on the East Coast, and one of his family members had died, and he was saying that they were having a hard time because it was at a time where it was a problem, that they had it was essential that they were buried within a certain number of hours in a certain kind of box that wasn't the big fancy caskets that are known with the concrete vaults and everything. And that they were adamant about that's what had to be, and they were having a really hard time where they lived getting someone to do that. And he was just beside himself because he said it has to be that way. We have to do that. And I didn't know that until he did that.
Yes, I worked at a cemetery called Crestlawn Memorial Park in Atlanta, Georgia. And when I was in mortuary school, we did talk about caring for Jewish families. The Hevra Kadisha comes in and does what they do. And within 24 hours, you're basically burying that person who happens to be of that faith and culture in a pine box. But then we also served a huge Asian population, a huge Black population, a huge white population. And the thing that opened my eyes as a Black woman from the South, the deep South, was that though everyone does things a little bit differently, at the end of the day, we all want the same things, right? We want to have a safe space to celebrate the life of our loved ones, but what does that look like? And the thing that I tell my students a lot of times is that it's not so much about what you do, it's about what you say and sometimes what you don't say. And so learning to have conversations with people, again, that are different, or learning to hold space and appreciate things that are different about people, it's important. And one of the biggest things that I've learned throughout my career is that it is okay sometimes to say that I am unfamiliar with your culture or your practice, and I'd like you to teach me. And what that does is that kind of puts the family or the loved one or community in the driver's seat, which they should always be in. As professionals, I think sometimes we get into our egos and we want to take control because we think we know what we're doing. But at the end of the day, we are in service to others. And so asking the question or saying that you don't know or understand certain things puts that family, or if you want to be technical, that consumer, back in the driver's seat and gives you the opportunity to learn.
That's so important. Our world is becoming so multicultural. I remember when I was growing up that some statistics came out that said that the white race wasn't going to be the dominant race in the not too distant future in the United States. And people were just beside themselves. They were so upset about that. What can we do? Yeah. They don't mind going to Chinese restaurants and Mexican restaurants, but they don't want to live with them, And it's just, it just kind of blew me away because I was young when that happened. And I just remembered thinking, aren't they all people? What difference does it make? Why are you upset? And
that's a terrifying thought. I have seen similar articles. I remember there was a Time magazine cover that came out. Oh gosh, I don't remember when, but it was like what humans will look like 100 years from now. And do you know what I'm talking about? I see you nodding over there.
Yeah,
and
I remember that coming out.
Yeah, it was a very ambiguous woman on the front of the cover. Really ambiguous and androgynous, because I don't remember whether she was or they were male or female. And I mean, even when we talk about cultural differences, that opens the door to pronouns and identity and just so many different core factors of how we relate to other people. And I think that fear comes from ignorance. Because if we really are to think back, and I'm just looking through the death care lens, many of our practices are rooted in Black culture. So it's kind of funny to me. It's almost comical and ironic at the same time that our death care education, especially here in the United States, is so whitewashed.
Yeah, that's really true. I was amazed when I went to Bali. Do you know how they handle deaths in Bali? Have you heard about that?
I have not. Please educate me.
It was kind of fascinating. We were driving one day, and we didn't drive. Somebody always drove us because it's crazy to drive there. And somebody had invited me to go along on this trip to her to see something that the rest of us weren't going to be able to see. And it was way kind of out in the country. And so I was getting to see beautiful different things, the big fields of rice growing and the homes. And they do so much with bamboo there that's just fascinating. And we went by this one home that had these bamboo, really tall stakes, 4 of them with like a coffin size, like a wooden coffin size box on top of it. It was all ornately decorated with flowers, and it was really beautiful, but it was really tall, way up above where people could see it, and unless they were kind of looking from a distance to see what it was. And I asked about it, and they said that was somebody who was waiting to be buried, and they can only bury people on certain days, and their whole calendar's different. They don't have 365 days in a year, and they only do certain things on certain days within the calendar. And so because the bodies deteriorate, they would just put them up away where people didn't see them and didn't smell them, and kept them up there at their home, in front of their home, until it was time to bury them. And then if you didn't have the money to pay for your funeral, there was like this mass grave where they would bury people. And then when you got the money together, they'd dig up what was left of the body and bury it then. And I thought that was kind of interesting too. And then I was just talking the other day, interviewing somebody in Bali, and he said, not only that, but they will dig the bones up and clean them about every year.
Wow.
So they're not buried in like caskets because they couldn't get to the bones to clean them and put them back in the ground.
Wow. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's fascinating. And that's actually one of my goals for not necessarily 2024, but 2025. I want to get the Academy full and going full steam next year. But in 2025, I actually aspire to travel and witness some of what you're talking about. So thank you so much for sharing that story. It reminds me of I know in other cultures, like some Hispanic cultures and also in some African cultures, there's a practice, I believe in Zimbabwe, called turning of the bones or famadayana, where every 7 years people are taken out of their remains are taken from their graves and marched through the cities and redressed and put back. And I've always found that fascinating. I feel like there's something extremely spiritual about that ritual. I don't know if I would necessarily be able to handle my loved one going through that. But again, that speaks to culture. If that's your norm, if that is your practice, then it's not odd or bizarre or even emotional anymore. It's actually beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I had an experience when I went to Tuscany, and we stayed for a while. And this traveling I did was with a ceramics organization where we'd go and learn how to do different ceramics in different countries, and it was really fabulous. And we stayed at this place that was like a castle on a hill that had the wall all the way around it. And you couldn't drive up to it. Normal people couldn't drive up to it. They did have a way now in modern times to be able to deliver food and services and stuff, a road to do that. But regular people had to go up on a funicular, I think that's how you say it, up the side of the hill to get to it. And it wasn't really a castle, but it wasn't, when I say castle, people think of these big grand things, and it wasn't like that. It was more like this walled village that had one big room at the end, and in that room they do things like have services and weddings and different things down there. And while I was there, they were having a celebration of somebody who had been very important to them in their church there many years ago, like centuries probably ago. And I don't know whether it was her death date or her birthday or what it was, but they were celebrating her. And to celebrate her, they carried her bones, or relics of her bones, not her whole skeleton, but relics of her bones. They carried them through the whole community there, up and down the streets, and music and singing and lots of stuff going on. And there were a ton of people there. Not that many people lived in this place anymore, but people would come for this celebration. And it was just fascinating to watch this, that the whole celebration was about carrying those bones around the street.
You know, that's utterly beautiful. And you said something just now that made me think about the sacred aspect of things. And I know, like, as a funeral professional, it's my job to offer various disposition methods, whether they be cremation, alkaline hydrolysis, green burial, eco-friendly burial, traditional burial, right? But I really think that for the sake of this conversation, there's something special about bones. And I wonder if we, by expanding our disposition methods to allow us to do away with bones, which are the remnants, that's really all that's left from our skeletal system, right? Like our bones and our DNA that's in the bones. I wonder if we are, in a sense, deleting a part of our history with those disposition methods. and what that preservation level looks like. Not saying that disposition methods that do away with bones are bad. They're not.
Mm-hmm.
But there has to be something spiritual. There's a spiritual essence with the bones, because this is something similar that's similar across too many different cultures and too many different geographical locations.
Yes. Yeah, that's amazing to me. The different things, and I think studying that is really important, because we lose a sense of our history. There's so much history that I don't want to say it's made up. It's not exactly made up, but it's so long ago that we don't have anybody who witnessed it. It's actually
Right.
telling us about it, and we didn't have the ways of writing and publishing and things that we do now. So what we get are stories that are passed on, and that's all we have to build these histories on.
Yes.
And then they're with all the research they're doing around the world with archaeologists and things, they're finding different bones that are left that look different than they anticipated that they were going to look. So there's so much to that. But then there are other people that I don't know whether they don't want it. Like, one of the things that they do here in Hawaii is that you can have a burial at sea.
Mm-hmm.
And the bones probably are out there floating around someplace, but trying to put them together with who they could possibly have been isn't going to happen.
It's kind of like a funny thought I'm having twofold. Like, maybe at 1,000 years from now, we'll be misidentified as some type of mer people, if that's the
Yeah.
Or I remember when I was a little kid, I used to really think a lot about autopsies for some reason, which is so weird now that I think about it.
Yeah.
But I thought an autopsy was where you basically open a person's head and there's a movie that plays of their life.
Oh, wow.
And that's how you find out how they died. Like, those last few seconds on that autopsy tape in this person's mind would tell you how they died. But I was reading an article in some type of scientific journal that was stating that blood actually makes a sound. And I don't want to say I've heard the sound, but, part of the embalming process is removing the blood from the vascular system, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I've always had this feeling when performing embalmings, that the blood shouldn't be just put down the drain. It should be stored individually, right? But I can't explain why I've had that feeling. But after reading that article and having this conversation today, I think at some point in the future, it will be possible to almost have like a forensic files type scenario where they're able to look at bloods and string together DNA and project it visually to see what a person looks like, not just in theory. Like, we know you can look at the DNA of an individual and find out their hair color, their skin tone, things like that. But I think with technology and anthropology working together, there will be a way that through drone research, we can get a visual image of someone on a projector screen.
Yeah, I'm sure that happens or will happen. There's so much. I used to be, one of my careers was I worked as a nurse, and I had a job. One of my jobs was in the operating room.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved it because I loved seeing the inside of bodies when they're working.
Yes.
It was just so fascinating to see all that. And I think it would be wonderful for everybody to have the opportunity to see what it really is like inside. We all have a concept of it in our minds, and we all have a body, and I think we could take better care of it if we knew more about it.
I agree. And like you, I love seeing the inside of us. I remember the first time I saw an autopsy case, it was at mortuary school. And I remember we went to Popeyes, of all places, for lunch. And we were to report back to the school at 4:00 and go into the anatomy lab. and there was going to be an autopsy body there, and some senior level students would be performing the embalming, right? And we could observe they had this huge mirror on the ceiling so that we could look down into the cadaver. And I remember it was almost like that click, 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 click going up a roller coaster. That's the feeling I had inside, because I knew once I walked out of that anatomy lab or into that anatomy lab and saw the inside of a human being, I would never be the same again. And the experience, for lack of a better description, did not disappoint. It changed the way that I view not only myself, but others. We do a lot of things aesthetically on the outside, which are wonderful. It's a gift, right? But when you really see a heart, or you see a liver or intestines, and then you see some of the pathological things that happen through sickness, right? It for me, it changed and made me so much more in awe of us as human beings.
Yes, it does. You are changed if you see things from the inside out. You can't help it.
Yeah,
it's really different.
But it almost, my work again is in diversity, equity, inclusion, cultural competency, and advocating for Black, decedents and communities. But it also made me realize how much we're all the same.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. All of us have the same colored blood, basically.
Yes. The same colored organs, unless they've been damaged in some way. And it's like, how do you create that balance? Or for me, it really, I don't want to, curse on your platform, but it really made me wonder, how did we get it so effed up that we truly believe that this person is better or worse than this person because of what's on the outside? If we really thought about what's on the inside. And the thing that, like, the most intriguing part for me to see was when people have cranial autopsies, when our brains are taken out and there's nothing there but the inside of your head, right? And it's like everything that we believe about the outside or inside of us is controlled by this thing. And where did we get this line of separation? Because they're all the same in children and babies and people that are 100 years old, people that are 20 years old,
It's fascinating. You just brought up a memory for me of when I first started teaching at the university. When you're new, frequently you have to share offices. You don't get your own office for a while. And I was sharing an office, even though I was teaching writing, I was sharing it with a scientist. And for some reason, he had a human brain in a bottle of formaldehyde on the desk that we shared. And we'd never be in the same room at the same time. So I never got to, I don't even know what he looked like. I never got to ask him, why is there a brain on my desk? But I couldn't help but look at that so often and so deeply and thinking about how, well, like everybody's brain is the same color. So why do we think in different colors,
Right.
And it really, really was something to contemplate of how brains work. How can brains possibly orchestrate what bodies do?
Very much true.
They're just a blob of stuff.
Right. Very, very fragile stuff, though. Isn't that's the most, like, it's fragile. And then for me, I think a lot about the emotional aspect of grief and emotional aspect of, thinking about death and how much an anxiety it creates for a lot of people. And it's like those organs that we're talking about seeing, I don't think that they have emotions. I don't think that they have feelings, but I think that they are strongly impacted by our feelings, right? But where in our bodies are those feelings coming from? Like, I know I teach a lot about, I do something called grief alchemy, and it's aligned with the chakra system. And we work through the different stages, the different aspects of grief in conjunction with the chakra system, right? And I know, like, okay, our root chakra, that has a lot to do with, our bottom half. And then our intuition is supposedly in our sacral chakra and our identity, just those things like that. But it's like, where do these emotions come from? And why are our organs so heavily impacted by them? And then that creates, I guess, the string theory of ripples that goes throughout the universe and creates our reality. And it just goes so deep. And I'm still trying to figure out what I believe about the afterlife or what happens after we die. But should I have the opportunity to talk to God, I really want to see the universe from the inside out.
Oh, wow. Wow. That's a book.
Yeah, isn't it? Okay, I'm gonna work on that.
There, yeah, wow.
The universe from the inside out. Okay, Neil Tyson deGrasse, if you should hear this, call the grave woman, okay?
Yeah. He'd be the one. That'd be great.
Yes. But yeah, and I say that because I feel like we look at it as such like this big complex thing with these planets, and we're supposedly only a minute fraction of our galaxy that exists within this sea of galaxies. But I really wonder what that would look like from a mirror pointing down perspective, and how that coordinates or aligns with our physical bodies, because it's my belief that we are the cosmos, right? You are a planet or galaxy of your own, and we're interacting and creating something now, but then we're also using the power of the universe to have this conversation. I'm in South Carolina, you're in Maui. And so we're using that energy, and it'll be broadcast back into itself. And I just want to know what that looks like. Does it look like the vascular system? Does it look like the organs? What does it all make?
That reminds me of a couple of things. One was the first time that I flew in a big jet across the country, and I always get a window seat because I'm just fascinated with looking out of the window. And I realized that I didn't see any people, and I realized how many people had to be there underneath me, that how insignificant our bodies are in the grand scheme of things. And that really still has stuck with me all this time, that we think we're all that, and really we're just such a tiny particle of the whole thing. And the other thing that I noticed is how things are similar that don't seem like they'd have any similarity. And to give you an example of that, if you see a kidney that's cut in half, and you see what it looks like inside, with it's almost like little rivers that have, space in between. And I saw a picture or not a picture, I saw when I was flying over this one place, it was like a delta where all the water came into this area. And I thought, that looks just like a picture of a kidney. And so I started seeing it other places too. There's so many mirrors of things that are so similar that there's got to be some sort of connection there.
There has to be, Emily. And I remember reading, or not even reading, I think it was a video on YouTube. It was like a woman who had done a Sunday Soul session with Oprah when she did those, right?
Yeah.
And she had a stroke. And she lost, of course, consciousness and cognitive function in this realm, but she woke up to herself cosmically and spiritually, I would say. And even in her stroke and after her stroke, though she had to recover, and she basically had no connection to anyone who was in her life prior to her stroke, because that part of her brain and memories were affected. But her connection to the universe replaced that. And she said that she realized how small her physical was and how massively big her spirit was. And for me, as a death care worker, as a human, that is what I desire for all of us. Like, looking at life from the end, because I think a lot of people that work in the grief space and the death care space, whether it be through our experiences, our exposure, whatever it is, we tend to look at things from the end, right? And we see how massively insignificant small things are, right? And if we can see that in our limited capacity, how much bigger do our spirits see it? And that's what I want to work towards, is seeing things from that perspective on a bigger level.
Oh,
And your
yeah.
analogy is so on point with the airplane and not seeing any people. When you said that, it literally sent chills through my body, because I have experienced that. It's almost like you don't see anyone. You just see this thing that we walk and live on every day, but we don't even see because we're in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. Also, I was thinking about Dr. Eben Alexander. Have you heard of him?
I haven't.
He wrote a book called Proof of Heaven.
Okay.
And he is a neurologist, neuroscientist. Really, everything is just the facts, ma'am. And
Right.
he said that he would do surgery on somebody, and they'd go, "Oh, doctor, you don't know what happened. You just wouldn't believe all the things that happened while I was unconscious." And he'd go, "Yeah," and he didn't say it, but he thought, "Yeah, I wouldn't believe it," sort of attitude toward it. And then one day he had a very rapid onset of encephalitis, which destroys your brain from the outside going in. It just kind of eats away at it. And the particular kind of encephalitis that he had was almost always fatal. And it usually didn't take too much time to get to that point, because it like eats up your brain. And his family was dealing with him being in a coma and assuming that they were going to be having to make a decision of when to pull the plug and that sort of thing. And it only lasted a week, and he woke up. And when he woke up, he had a lot of coming back into the world to experience, because things were so different, and he didn't quite have the memory of everything, but his memory did all come back. He's working as a physician today. And he wrote this book called Proof of Heaven about the experience and where he was when he was unconscious and what happened. And he told some experiences that he had with his family that to him were absolute proof that actually did happen, and that we are around after we physically die. That people are you can't, I don't know whether you call them people, but the essence of the people is still there.
Wow. I truly believe that. And that, again, speaking about culture, that's a big part of my culture, whether it be through ancestral veneration or communicating with those that have transitioned physically. Like, that's been something I've been able to do my whole life. And so there's just so much we don't know. There's so much we don't know. But I think, again, that perspective of looking from the inside out, and a conversation my husband and I have been having a lot lately is looking inside your soul and deciding, what is it that you want? Because for us, the conversation is about career. He's a little bit younger than I am, and he's trying to decide, do I want to stay here? Do I want to go back to school? What do I want to do? And the thing I keep telling him is to get still and go inside your soul. Because yes, I know as a man, you want to provide, you want to protect, and you want to ensure we have a great life financially. But at the same time, what feeds you, right? And again, that perspective of looking from the end back. When I think about the end, the last question I want to ask my husband is about money. When I think about us saying goodbye to each other for the last time. But what is it that feeds your soul? What is it that nurtures your soul? And I wonder a lot of times when I'm working with deceased individuals, was your life worth it to your soul? Is your exit truly an exit, or is it a beginning because maybe your soul wasn't fed? And I'm not talking about through religion or through dogma, but through everyday experiences and like conversations like this. I'm so grateful for this opportunity, because I love conversations like this. This is feeding my soul. It's making me ask some really deep questions within myself and hearing your thoughts. And I'm just so appreciative. So thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here. I just realized how long we've talked, so we need to kind of wind this up. I appreciate you being here today, and I'm sure we are going to have a lot of people doing some deep thinking after they listen to this conversation.
I hope so.
I'm sure we will. Can't help it. Well, thank you so much for being my guest, and I'm so appreciate you being here. As you said, I enjoy this kind of conversation because it's the kind of conversations we need to have about what's really real in our lives.
Yeah, I do. And thank you, Jane. I'm pretty sure you'll hear this. Thank you for connecting us. Jane Asher, author of The Next Room.
Yeah, that's another really good book that's kind of on the subject. So I recommend that one highly. I also recommend the Proof of Heaven by Dr. Eben Alexander. Also, those two books, both of them will make you think like you never have before. So thank you. And to my guests, we'll have in the show notes the links so that you can find The Grave Woman online. Or you can search for The Grave Woman, because I don't think there's another one out there besides you.
There's not. It's just me. I'm The Grave Woman everywhere. So just look me up on social media, my website, YouTube, podcast, everywhere.
That's wonderful. So thank you all for listening, and I hope you think a lot. And let me know what you think. I'd really like to hear some feedback on these things that we talked about today. And I'll see you next time and have another wonderful guest for you to listen to. Do you want more comfort, support, and happiness? Join the Grief and Happiness Alliance. Visit my website at lovingandlivingyourwaythroughgrief.com and read my book, Loving and Living Your Way Through Grief. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast, rate it, review it, and binge on all our episodes on grief and happiness. I can't wait to welcome you back to another episode